People often mistake silence for submission. If someone doesn't raise their voice, doesn't puff out their chest, doesn't announce who they are, we assume they lack power. We're taught, subtly and constantly, that strength has a look. It's loud. It's aggressive. It demands space. And anyone who doesn't perform strength that way gets labeled as harmless, soft, or easy to push aside. That assumption is where danger begins. Quiet strength doesn't advertise itself. It doesn't need to. It comes from experience, not ego. From discipline, not impulse. The most capable people in the room are often the ones watching, measuring, deciding when action is actually necessary. They understand that reacting too early creates chaos, and reacting too late creates regret. So they wait. And that waiting is often misread as fear. Society rewards visible confidence, even when it's empty. Someone who talks over others, who escalates minor conflicts, who uses intimidation as a shortcut, is quickly perceived as dominant. Meanwhile, the person who remains calm, grounded, and controlled is seen as weak. This misunderstanding creates a false hierarchy where noise is mistaken for authority and restraint is mistaken for vulnerability. In reality, restraint is expensive. It takes effort. It takes control. Anyone can lash out. Anyone can lose their temper. But staying composed when provoked requires a kind of internal structure that most people don't have. Quiet strength is built through repetition, hardship, and accountability. It's learned in environments where mistakes cost more than pride, where emotional outbursts aren't dramatic moments, but liabilities. Underestimating that kind of strength isn't just a social error. It's a tactical one. People who rely on intimidation often do so because it's all they have. Their confidence is fragile, dependent on others backing down. The moment resistance appears, their control evaporates. That's why they target those they believe won't fight back. Not because they're brave, but because they're afraid of real opposition. Quietly strong individuals don't need to prove themselves. They've already proven who they are, often in places no one else sees. Their sense of self doesn't depend on winning every interaction or dominating every space. They choose when to engage and when to walk away. And that choice is power. There's also a cultural bias at play. We associate physical strength with size, gender, and appearance. We assume certain bodies are capable and others are not. That assumption blinds people. It narrows their perception and makes them reckless. History is full of examples where the underestimated outperformed the obvious favorite, not because they were lucky, but because they were prepared. Quiet strength also carries a moral dimension. It's often paired with responsibility. People who know what they can do are more careful about when they do it. They understand consequences. They understand escalation. They don't look for conflict because they know how far conflict can go. That awareness makes them cautious, not passive. The danger comes when others confuse that caution for incapacity. When someone pushes past boundaries assuming there will be no response, they're gambling on their own narrative. They're betting that the person in front of them fits the story they've invented. And when that story is wrong, the outcome can change instantly. What looked like control becomes exposure. What felt like dominance becomes vulnerability. Underestimating quiet strength is also a failure of empathy. It requires ignoring the fact that everyone carries history. Everyone has survived something. Just because someone doesn't display their scars doesn't mean they don't exist. The calmest person in the room may have learned that calm the hard way. There's a reason trained professionals emphasize de-escalation. Not because they can't handle violence, but because they understand it too well. They know how fast situations spiral, how thin the line is between control and catastrophe. Their silence is not uncertainty. It's calculation. When society teaches us to equate loudness with strength, it creates blind spots. It rewards posturing and punishes patience. It elevates those who appear powerful and ignores those who actually are. And in everyday interactions, that misunderstanding encourages people to test limits they don't understand. Quiet strength doesn't announce itself before it acts. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't warn for the sake of ego. When it moves, it does so with precision, purpose, and finality. And the people who underestimated it often realize their mistake only after they've crossed a line they can't step back. Over-violence rarely starts at its peak. It begins in moments people brush off as insignificant. A comment that goes too far. A shove disguised as a joke. A raised voice meant to establish dominance. Most people involved don't believe they're stepping into something serious. They think they're still in control. That belief is usually the first mistake. Escalation happens faster than people are prepared for. The human nervous system reacts before logic has time to intervene. Once physical boundaries are crossed, adrenaline floods the body and perception narrows. Fine motor skills degrade. Decision-making shortcuts take over. What felt like a manageable situation seconds earlier becomes chaotic without warning. Many people assume violence follows a linear path, that there's time to pause, reconsider, and step back. In reality, it often jumps levels. One act provokes another, and the pace accelerates. A single strike invites retaliation. A crowd changes the energy. Pride enters the equation. At that point, reason is no longer steering the interaction. There's also a dangerous myth that people will stop themselves once they realize they've gone too far. But violence doesn't come with a built-in brake system. Once fear and aggression take over, the instinct is to dominate or escape, not to self-correct. That's why so many confrontations end with outcomes no one originally intended. Public spaces make escalation even more unpredictable. Onlookers don't always calm situations. Sometimes they amplify them. Someone filming, someone shouting, someone cheering. Social pressure pushes people to perform rather than retreat. Backing down starts to feel like losing face, and the situation hardens instead of dissolving. People who initiate violence often misjudge the threshold they're crossing. They think a slap, a push, or a threat is reversible. They believe they can dial it back if necessary. What they don't understand is that once they introduce physical force, they surrender control over how the other person responds. The rules change instantly. Training and experience shape how escalation unfolds. Someone untrained may panic or overcommit, using excessive force out of fear. Someone trained may respond decisively, efficiently, and without hesitation. The gap between those responses is enormous, and it's rarely visible until the moment arrives. By then, it's too late to adjust expectations. Escalation is also fueled by assumptions. People assume the other person will freeze, or comply, or be intimidated. When those assumptions fail, confusion sets in. Confusion leads to overreaction. Overreaction leads to harm. All of it happens in seconds, not minutes. There's a reason professionals emphasize early boundary setting. Clear verbal cues, controlled posture, and awareness of distance aren't about intimidation. They're about preventing a situation from crossing the point of no return. Once hands are thrown, options narrow dramatically. Another factor people underestimate is the presence of loved ones. When someone feels responsible for protecting another person, their tolerance for threat drops to zero. The calculation changes. What might have been ignored becomes unacceptable. Escalation becomes immediate because the stakes are no longer personal pride, but safety. Alcohol, ego, and group dynamics shorten the fuse even further. Each one reduces inhibition and increases risk-taking. Together, they create an environment where escalation feels justified, even necessary. The story people tell themselves in those moments is that they're responding, not initiating, even when the opposite is true. Violence also distorts time. Moments stretch and compress unpredictably. People misremember sequences. They underestimate how quickly events unfolded. This distortion makes it harder to recognize warning signs in the moment and harder to learn from the aftermath. The most dangerous part of escalation is how ordinary it feels at the beginning. There's no alarm, no clear signal that things are about to spiral. Just a sense of tension, a flicker of irritation, a test of boundaries. By the time the danger is obvious, the window for prevention has already closed. People who understand how quickly violence escalates don't romanticize confrontation. They avoid unnecessary friction. They recognize that the difference between a story told and a life altered can be one impulsive decision. They know that control is fragile, and once lost, it rarely returns on command. Escalation isn't about intent. It's about momentum. And momentum doesn't care what anyone originally meant to happen. Fear is often described as something to overcome, something that freezes people in place. But fear doesn't always paralyze. In certain moments, it sharpens. When a parent senses a threat to their child, fear transforms into focus. The body prioritizes protection over self-preservation, and the usual calculations about risk and consequence fall away. A mother's instinct is not abstract or sentimental. It is physical. It lives in the nervous system. Long before conscious thought forms, the body reacts. Heart rate spikes. Vision locks onto the threat. Distance, timing, and movement become clear in a way they weren't seconds earlier. This response isn't learned through logic. It's wired through survival. What changes in those moments is the hierarchy of values. Personal safety drops below the safety of the child. Social norms lose their authority. The fear of embarrassment, injury, or legal consequences becomes irrelevant. The only metric that matters is whether the threat is neutralized. That shift is immediate and irreversible. People who underestimate this instinct often assume that fear will cause retreat. They expect hesitation. What they don't account for is the protective override that comes with responsibility. When someone is responsible for another life, especially one that cannot defend itself, the threshold for action disappears. There is no room for negotiation with danger. This instinct doesn't make someone reckless. It makes them decisive. Movements become efficient. Choices become simple. The body draws on everything it has, including strength, speed, and endurance that may never have been accessed before. Stories of parents lifting cars or running through injuries aren't myths. They are examples of the body operating without its usual limits. A mother protecting her child is not thinking about winning or losing. She is thinking about removal of threat. That mindset is fundamentally different from ego-driven aggression. There is no performance, no desire to dominate, no interest in proving anything. There is only a problem and an urgent need to solve it. This is why attempts to intimidate in front of a child are so dangerous. What might have worked in a different context becomes useless. The presence of a child reframes the situation entirely. The threat is no longer hypothetical. It is immediate, personal, and unacceptable. There is also a moral clarity that emerges in these moments. Doubt evaporates. The internal debates that slow most decisions vanish. The line between right and wrong feels obvious. That clarity fuels action and sustains it, even in the face of pain or exhaustion. People often talk about instinct as something primitive, but in reality, it's highly adaptive. It integrates experience, awareness, and biology into a single response. For someone with training or past exposure to danger, that instinct becomes even more precise. Fear doesn't cloud judgment. It accelerates it. The presence of a child also removes the option of disengagement. Walking away may protect the adult, but it leaves the child vulnerable. That reality locks the parent into the situation. Retreat is no longer a safe choice. Engagement becomes the only path that leads to security. This is why protective instincts can override fear of injury. Pain becomes secondary. The body absorbs impact differently when the mind is fixed on protection. Injuries are often noticed only after the threat is gone. Adrenaline masks damage, allowing continued action beyond normal tolerance. There is a quiet ferocity in this kind of response. It doesn't look like rage. It looks like resolve. It is controlled, directed, and relentless. Every movement has purpose. There is no wasted energy because there is no room for it. Society often underestimates this force because it doesn't align with stereotypes of aggression. A calm, attentive mother doesn't fit the image of someone capable of extreme action. That misconception creates dangerous blind spots. It leads people to push boundaries they shouldn't. When fear is redirected toward protection, it becomes a resource rather than an obstacle. It heightens awareness. It accelerates reaction time. It strengthens resolve. In those moments, fear is not something to be conquered. It is something to be used. The most profound aspect of this instinct is that it leaves no space for self-doubt. There is no questioning whether action is justified. The justification is the child's safety. That certainty carries people through situations they never imagined surviving. Attempts to threaten or harm someone in front of their child trigger a response that is older than language and stronger than reason. Once activated, it does not negotiate. It does not pause. It moves forward until the danger no longer exists. Training is invisible until it's needed. It doesn't announce itself in posture or volume. It lives beneath the surface, stored in muscle memory and pattern recognition, waiting for a moment when thinking is too slow. Under pressure, people don't rise to the occasion. They fall to the level of their preparation. When stress hits, the brain reverts to what it knows best. Fine reasoning degrades, and habits take over. For someone untrained, that often means panic, freezing, or explosive overreaction. For someone trained, it means structure. Breathing stays controlled. Movements remain efficient. The body follows rehearsed sequences without conscious direction. Pressure exposes the difference between confidence and competence. Confidence can vanish in an instant when reality intrudes. Competence remains because it's built through repetition, not belief. Training replaces uncertainty with options. It creates a framework for action when chaos removes clarity. One of the key purposes of training is stress inoculation. Repeated exposure to controlled difficulty teaches the nervous system that discomfort is survivable. Heart rate spikes become familiar. Tunnel vision is recognized and managed. The body learns that it can function even when flooded with adrenaline. That familiarity is what allows trained individuals to operate while others shut down. Training also simplifies decision-making. Instead of weighing countless possibilities, the trained mind recognizes patterns. Certain movements signal certain intentions. Certain distances require certain responses. This reduces hesitation, which is often the most dangerous element in high-pressure situations. There is a misconception that training makes people aggressive. In reality, it often does the opposite. Those who understand violence tend to avoid it. They recognize how quickly it spirals and how permanent the consequences can be. Training brings respect for thresholds. It teaches when not to act as much as when to act. When action becomes unavoidable, training reveals itself through restraint and precision. Movements are economical. Force is applied with purpose rather than emotion. There is no flailing, no wasted effort. The goal is not to punish or dominate, but to end the threat as efficiently as possible. Another aspect of training is adaptability. Real situations never unfold exactly as rehearsed. Training doesn't create rigid scripts. It builds principles. Balance, distance, timing, leverage. These principles allow adjustment in real time. When something goes wrong, the trained person doesn't freeze. They transition. Training also conditions awareness. A trained individual notices details others miss. Shifts in body language. Changes in tone. The presence of additional threats. This awareness often prevents escalation before it becomes physical. When prevention fails, that same awareness informs response. People often misinterpret calmness under pressure as lack of emotion. In truth, trained individuals feel fear and stress like anyone else. The difference is that they've learned to function alongside those emotions rather than be ruled by them. Training doesn't remove fear. It gives it boundaries. There's also an ethical component to training. Many systems emphasize responsibility alongside capability. The more skilled someone becomes, the more accountable they are for their actions. This reinforces discipline and discourages misuse of force. Power is paired with restraint. Under pressure, training becomes visible in what doesn't happen. No shouting, no panic, no unnecessary escalation. The absence of chaos is the evidence. The response looks almost understated to an untrained observer, which is why it's often underestimated. Training also affects recovery. After the moment passes, trained individuals are more likely to regain composure quickly. Breathing slows. Awareness widens. The nervous system resets more efficiently. This allows clearer assessment of injuries, surroundings, and next steps. The most revealing moments are those where there is no time to think. When the body moves before the mind catches up. In those moments, training is no longer something someone has. It is something they are. It shapes posture, timing, and choice in ways that can't be faked. This is why training doesn't need to be visible to be effective. It waits quietly, accumulating through hours of repetition and discipline. When pressure arrives, it surfaces without announcement, turning chaos into a sequence of manageable problems and transforming moments of danger into moments of controlled action. People carry assumptions into every interaction. These assumptions are built from culture, media, and personal bias. We size others up in seconds, deciding who holds power and who does not. Those judgments feel instinctive, but they are learned, and they are often wrong. Power is commonly associated with visibility. Height, muscle, volume, and confidence are treated as indicators of dominance. Quiet people, smaller bodies, women, and those who don't perform toughness are frequently dismissed as incapable. This shortcut thinking simplifies the world, but it also distorts it. Public spaces reinforce these assumptions. Who people give way to, who interrupts without consequence, who occupies space without apology. These patterns teach us whose presence matters. Over time, these signals harden into expectations. We stop seeing individuals and start seeing categories. Weakness, in this framework, becomes a label assigned rather than a reality observed. It's based on appearance, tone, and conformity to stereotypes. Someone who doesn't match the expected image of strength is treated as less threatening, less capable, and less worthy of caution. This is why so many confrontations begin with miscalculation. One person believes they hold the upper hand because the other doesn't look like a challenge. That belief shapes behavior. Boundaries are pushed. Respect is withheld. Aggression feels safe. Media plays a significant role in shaping these assumptions. Strength is dramatized as loud and explosive. Heroes announce themselves. Villains posture. Subtle competence rarely gets attention because it doesn't translate as spectacle. As a result, people learn to equate strength with performance rather than substance. Gender expectations deepen this divide. Men are often presumed capable by default, while women are expected to justify their strength. A woman's calm is mistaken for passivity. Her restraint is seen as submission. Her presence is underestimated until proven otherwise. These assumptions aren't just inaccurate. They're dangerous. They encourage people to test limits they shouldn't. When someone believes another person lacks power, they feel entitled to dominate. That entitlement fuels escalation. Public assumptions also affect how people respond to conflict as observers. Bystanders may hesitate to intervene when they believe one person is clearly dominant and the other is weak. They may misread who is actually at risk. This misjudgment can delay help and worsen outcomes. There's also a social cost to appearing strong in unconventional ways. People who don't fit stereotypes of power often downplay their abilities to avoid confrontation or scrutiny. They learn that revealing competence can provoke resentment or disbelief. This creates a cycle where true capability stays hidden. Strength expressed through control, patience, and awareness doesn't register in a culture that values spectacle. It's easy to overlook until it's required. When it finally surfaces, it disrupts the narrative people have built. The shock comes not from the strength itself, but from the realization that the assumptions were wrong. These assumptions shape behavior long before any conflict occurs. They influence how close people stand, how they speak, and how much respect they offer. Once set, they are rarely questioned in the moment. People act on them as if they were facts. The danger lies in how confidently people rely on these false signals. Appearance feels reliable because it's immediate, but it's also superficial. It tells nothing about experience, training, resilience, or limits. Those qualities don't show until tested. Public assumptions also affect accountability. When someone perceived as strong acts aggressively, it's often excused as assertiveness. When someone perceived as weak defends themselves, it can be framed as overreaction. These double standards reinforce the same flawed hierarchy. Challenging these assumptions requires slowing down perception. It requires acknowledging uncertainty. But most people prefer certainty, even when it's inaccurate. They would rather rely on stereotypes than confront the complexity of individuals. Every misjudgment carries risk. When someone assumes power based on appearance, they gamble on a story they've invented. If that story collapses under pressure, the consequences can be immediate and severe. Public assumptions about power and weakness don't just misread people. They shape behavior in ways that create the very conflicts they fail to predict. Every boundary exists for a reason. Some are spoken, some implied, and some learned through experience. When someone crosses a boundary, they often believe the cost will be minimal. A warning, an argument, maybe a moment of discomfort. Rarely do they consider that some boundaries carry consequences that cannot be undone. People who violate boundaries usually don't see themselves as reckless. They see themselves as testing limits. They assume there is space to push, room to retreat if necessary. This belief is rooted in past experiences where boundaries were flexible or unenforced. Over time, that pattern builds confidence in the wrong direction. Unseen boundaries are the most dangerous. These are the limits shaped by personal history, training, trauma, and responsibility. They aren't visible on the surface. There's no sign that says how far is too far. To an outsider, the calm response looks like tolerance. In reality, it may be restraint under strict conditions. When someone crosses one of these boundaries, the response is often swift and decisive. Not because the person wants conflict, but because the line that was crossed represents a non-negotiable threshold. The cost of allowing the violation is higher than the cost of responding forcefully. People tend to think consequences are gradual, that there will be escalating warnings, a chance to correct course. But some boundaries are absolute. Once crossed, the situation changes instantly. The person enforcing the boundary isn't escalating. They're concluding. This is especially true when boundaries are tied to safety. When a line exists to protect a life, a child, or a deeply held responsibility, the response isn't measured by social expectations. It's measured by outcomes. The priority becomes stopping harm, not preserving appearances. The cost of crossing these boundaries is often paid in shock. The person who crossed the line didn't expect resistance, let alone decisive action. They misread the situation. They assumed their interpretation of control was accurate. When it collapses, they are unprepared for the shift. Consequences also extend beyond the immediate moment. Legal, physical, and psychological fallout can follow. A single action can alter how someone is perceived, treated, or remembered. These outcomes are rarely considered in the moment of decision. Impulse narrows vision. There's a cultural tendency to romanticize boundary pushing. It's framed as confidence, boldness, or strength. Respect for limits is dismissed as weakness. This narrative encourages people to ignore signals of discomfort or resistance. It rewards risk-taking without accountability. But boundaries are not challenges. They are warnings. Ignoring them doesn't make someone brave. It makes them vulnerable. The person who respects boundaries retains control. The person who violates them gives it up. Unseen boundaries are often maintained by people who have learned, through experience, that prevention is better than recovery. They don't announce their limits because they shouldn't have to. Respect is expected, not negotiated. The cost of crossing these boundaries is also moral. It forces the person enforcing them into action they may not want but feel compelled to take. The responsibility for that outcome lies with the one who crossed the line, not the one who responded. Many people misinterpret restraint as permission. They assume silence is consent. That assumption is a mistake. Restraint is often conditional. It exists until a specific threshold is reached. Once crossed, the restraint disappears completely. There is also a ripple effect. Witnesses internalize what happens when boundaries are ignored. Some learn to be more cautious. Others learn the wrong lesson and double down on aggression. The moment becomes a reference point, shaping future behavior. Crossing unseen boundaries reveals a lack of awareness. It shows an inability to read context, to recognize that not all limits are visible. That blindness creates risk not just for others, but for the person themselves. The most severe costs are paid when someone assumes they can retreat after testing a boundary. They believe there will be time to apologize, explain, or disengage. But once certain lines are crossed, the opportunity to step back vanishes. Boundaries don't exist to be challenged. They exist to prevent harm. When someone ignores them, they invite consequences that don't ask for consent and don't offer second chances.